The leather harness bit into her shoulders as Clara Ramsey threw her full weight against the straps, her boots sliding through the dirt before finding purchase on a half-buried stone. The iron plow blade scraped and shrieked against the rocky Arizona soil, moving perhaps 6 inches before catching on another obstinate rock embedded deep in the earth. She was 22 years old, alone on 40 acres of stubborn land outside Quartzsite, and at this moment she wondered if her father had cursed her or blessed her when he left her this parcel in his will. The sun hammered down on her back through the thin cotton of her work dress, already soaked with sweat despite the early hour. March of 1882 had brought unseasonably warm weather to the Arizona Territory, and Clara had been at this since dawn, having already spent 3 hours fighting with soil that seemed determined to reject any attempt at cultivation. Her late father had always said this land had potential, that the soil would yield good crops if only someone had the grit to break it properly. But her father had died last autumn before proving his theory, and her older brother had taken one look at these 40 acres and declared them worthless before heading to California with his share of the inheritance in cash. Clara had nowhere else to go. The small house her father built stood at the edge of the property, its adobe walls keeping the interior blessedly cool even in the worst heat. She had enough money saved to buy seed and perhaps make it through to harvest, but only if she could get this cursed field plowed in time for planting. She had tried to hire help in town, but the few men willing to do farm labor were already spoken for by the larger ranches and established farms. The bank had offered to buy her out for a pittance, barely enough to rent a room in town for 6 months, and the banker's cold smile had told her he expected her to fail and come crawling back within weeks. She would not give him that satisfaction. Gritting her teeth, Clara hauled against the harness again. The plow moved another foot before jamming against what felt like a boulder. She stopped, breathing hard, and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Her shoulders ached fiercely where the leather straps dug in, and she knew she would have bruises by evening. She had managed perhaps 20 yards of a single furrow in 3 hours. At this rate, she would be lucky to have a 1/4 acre ready by summer. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, shading her eyes against the sun. A rider approached from the direction of the main road, sitting easy in the saddle on a handsome roan horse. As he drew closer, Clara could make out a tall figure in worn denim and a dusty brown hat, a bedroll tied behind his saddle. Not a local rancher, then. Probably just a drifter passing through on his way to somewhere more promising. The rider slowed as he neared, then stopped his horse about 10 yards away. He pushed his hat back, revealing a weathered face that might have been anywhere from 25 to 35, with dark hair and eyes that took in the scene before him with quick intelligence. Those eyes moved from Clara to the plow, to the pathetic furrow behind her, and back to her face. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried a hint of Texas. "That is a hell of a way to spend a Tuesday." Clara straightened, suddenly aware of how she must look, strapped into a plow harness like a draft animal, her hair escaping its braid in wild tangles, her face red and running with sweat. Pride made her lift her chin. "I am managing just fine, thank you." The corner of his mouth twitched, but he had the grace not to smile. "Yes, madam, I can see that." He swung down from his horse with easy grace, and Clara realized he was quite tall, well over 6 feet. With broad shoulders and the lean build of a man who spent his life in physical work. "Name is Xavier Lockhart. I am looking for work in these parts, and it seems like you could use some help." "I cannot pay," Clara said bluntly. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "I have enough to buy seed and see me through to harvest if I'm careful, but nothing extra for hired hands." Xavier Lockhart looked at the field again, then at the small house in the distance. "You got a barn or outbuilding?" "A lean-to behind the house. Why?" "I will make you a deal," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "Let me sleep in that lean-to and give me 2 meals a day, and I will help you get this field plowed and planted. When harvest comes, if there is profit, you can pay me then. If there is not, well, at least I will have had a roof and regular food for a few months." Clara stared at him suspiciously. "Why would you do that?" You could find paying work at any of the big ranches. He shrugged. Maybe I'm tired of working for other men. Maybe I like the idea of having a stake in something, even if it is just a promise of future pay. Maybe I just do not like seeing someone try to pull a plow by themselves when there is a solution right here. He nodded toward his horse. I tried using my father's old mule, Clara admitted. She is too old and stubborn. She broke her lead and ran off. I have not been able to catch her since. Xavier glanced toward a distant stand of mesquite. That her grazing over there? Clara followed his gaze and felt her jaw clench. There was the mule, peacefully grazing as if she had not caused Clara 3 days of misery. Yes. I will catch her later, Xavier said. For now, let me get this field plowed for you. My horse is strong and well trained. We can have this acre done by sundown and the rest done within the week if the weather holds. Clara wanted to refuse. She wanted to prove she could do this alone, that she did not need help from a stranger, that she was not the helpless woman everyone in Quartzsite seemed to think her. But she was also practical enough to recognize the truth. She could not plow 40 acres by herself, or even the 10 acres she needed for a viable crop. She would fail, lose the land, and end up exactly where the banker expected her to be. 2 meals a day in the lean-to, she said, and if there is profit at harvest, you get a fair wage for the work, nothing more. Deal, Xavier said. He held out his hand. After a moment, Clara unbuckled the harness and let it fall from her shoulders, suppressing a wince as the weight came off the bruised flesh. She stepped forward and shook his hand. His grip was warm and calloused, his hand completely engulfing hers, but his touch was careful, as if he recognized she was already hurting. Let me get my horse hitched up, he said, releasing her hand and turning toward the roan. You should go sit in the shade and drink some water. You are red as a beet. I can help, Clara protested. Miss, no offense, but you look about ready to drop. Let me do this. You can tell me about the land and what you are planning to plant. Clara wanted to argue, but the truth was her legs were trembling and her head had started to ache from the heat. She nodded reluctantly and walked to the scraggly shade of a Palo Verde tree at the field's edge, where she had left a canteen of water. She sank down onto the ground and watched as Xavier efficiently unhitched his saddle and gear, then began attaching the plow harness to his horse. The roan stood patient and steady, clearly accustomed to work. Within minutes, Xavier had the arrangement sorted out in a way that had taken Clara hours to figure out with the mule. He glanced over at her. You want to start a new furrow or continue that one? Start fresh, Clara called back. That one is crooked anyway. He nodded and moved to the edge of the field, checking the plow blade and adjusting the straps. Then he clicked his tongue at the horse and started forward. The roan leaned into the harness, and the plow blade bit into the earth. Even from where she sat, Clara could see the difference. The furrow was straight and true, the blade cutting through soil that had fought her so viciously. Rocks scraped and pinged against metal, but Xavier and the horse kept moving steadily, making progress that would have taken her all day. She drank from the canteen and felt the ache in her shoulders begin to subside from sharp pain to dull throb. The shade helped, though the temperature was still climbing toward what would probably be a scorching afternoon. She watched Xavier work, noting the practiced way he handled the plow, keeping the horse steady and the line straight. He was no stranger to farm work, whatever else he might be. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Xavier had completed 4 long furrows across the acre field. He stopped the horse and walked back toward the tree. His own face flushed with heat now, his shirt showing dark patches of sweat. Clara had brought out a second canteen and offered it to him as he approached. Thank you, he said, drinking deeply. This is some stubborn ground. My father said the soil is good underneath once you break through the hard pan, Clara said. He thought it would grow wheat well, maybe even some vegetables if I could get a proper irrigation system set up. Xavier nodded, looking out over the field with a critical eye. He might have been right. The soil that is turning over looks decent enough. What is the water situation? There is a well by the house, good and deep, and a seasonal creek runs along the north edge of the property. It dries up by late summer, but it runs strong in spring." "Then your father knew what he was talking about," Xavier said. He drank again, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "This land has potential." "Everyone else in Quartzsite thinks I am a fool for trying," Clara said, the words coming out more bitter than she intended. "They expect me to fail and sell out to the bank." Xavier looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "Are you going to?" "No," Clara said firmly. "This is all I have left of my family. My mother died when I was 12. My brother took his half of the inheritance and left. This land is all that remains of my father's dreams. I am not giving it up." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, a look that might have been respect or understanding. "Then we better make sure you succeed," he said simply. He handed back the canteen and returned to the plow. They worked through the afternoon, Xavier behind the plow and Clara watching from the shade, feeling increasingly useless, but knowing she would only slow him down if she insisted on helping. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Xavier had finished the entire acre. The field lay in neat furrows, ready for planting, transformed from the impossible task it had been that morning. Xavier unhitched the horse and led it toward the house where Clara had pointed out the well. She walked alongside him, her legs stiff from sitting so long in the heat. At the well, Xavier drew water first for the roan, letting the animal drink its fill from the trough, then drawing fresh water for himself. He dumped an entire bucket over his head, shaking off like a dog, and Clara found herself looking away quickly, her cheeks warming for reasons that had nothing to do with the heat. "I should see about supper," she said. "The lean-to is around back. It is not much, but it is dry and has a cot." "I have slept in worse places," Xavier assured her. "Much worse." Clara headed into the house, grateful for the cool dimness after the bright heat outside. The single main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a small bedroom off to one side that had been her father's and was now hers. She had supplies enough to make a decent meal, and she was determined to keep her end of the bargain. If Xavier was going to work this hard, the least she could do was feed him properly. She built up the fire in the cook stove and set about making biscuits and beans with some of the salt pork she had been rationing carefully. It was humble fare, but it was filling and well prepared. She had learned to cook from her mother and had been keeping house since she was 13. By the time Xavier knocked on the door frame, the food was ready and the table was set. "Come in," she called. "It is ready." Xavier entered, hat in hand, his hair still damp from the well water. He had brushed most of the dust from his clothes and looked almost presentable, though his boots were still caked with adobe soil. He looked at the table, laden with food, and something crossed his face that might have been surprise. "This looks wonderful," he said. "Thank you." They sat down across from each other, and Clara served the food. For a few minutes they ate in silence, both too hungry for conversation. The beans were tender, the biscuits light, and Clara felt a small glow of satisfaction at the appreciative way Xavier ate, as if he had not had a home-cooked meal in some time. "So," Clara said finally, breaking the silence, "where are you from, Xavier Lockhart?" "Texas originally," he said, "near San Antonio. My father had a small ranch there." "Had?" "He died 5 years ago. Drought took most of the cattle, and the bank took the rest. My mother passed when I was young, no siblings, so I have been drifting since then, working where I can find it." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but Clara heard the echo of her own loss in his words. "I am sorry," she said, "about your father and the ranch." He shrugged. "It is the way of things sometimes. What about you? How did you end up out here alone?" Clara told him about her father's decision to move to Arizona territory, chasing rumors of good cheap land and new opportunities, how her brother had hated it from the start and left as soon as he could, how her father had worked himself to exhaustion trying to prove the land could be farmed, and how his heart had given out last October, leaving Clara alone with a dream and 40 acres of rocky soil. You could have sold out, Xavier observed. Gone somewhere easier. I could have, Clara agreed. But where would I go? I have no family left who wants me. I have no skills beyond keeping house and farming. At least here I have a chance at making something of my own, even if everyone thinks I will fail. They are wrong, Xavier said with quiet certainty. You are tougher than they think. Anyone who would strap themselves to a plow rather than give up is not going to fail for lack of determination. The simple confidence in his words warmed something in Clara's chest. She found herself smiling, perhaps the first real smile she had managed in weeks. Well, the determination is easier now that I have a horse and someone who knows how to use a plow properly. Xavier returned the smile, and Clara noticed for the first time that it transformed his weathered face, making him look younger and less guarded. I will catch that mule of yours tomorrow, he said. Having 2 animals will make the work go faster, and if you have any other fields you want to cultivate, we should plan that out. They spent the rest of the meal discussing the property, what Clara hoped to plant, and the work that would need to be done. Xavier asked intelligent questions and offered suggestions born of experience, and Clara found herself relaxing in a way she had not since her father died. It felt good to have someone to talk to about the land, someone who took her seriously and did not treat her like a foolish woman playing at farming. After supper, Xavier insisted on helping with the dishes, which surprised Clara. Most men she knew would have considered it beneath them. But Xavier simply rolled up his sleeves and heated water while Clara scraped the plates, and they worked side by side in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky outside. I should let you rest, Xavier said when the last dish was dried and put away. Dawn comes early. It does, Clara agreed. Thank you, Xavier, for today, for all of it. Thank you for the meal and the roof, friend, he replied. I will see you at breakfast. He let himself out, and Clara listened to his footsteps fade around the side of the house. She stood in the quiet kitchen, feeling the emptiness of the house settle around her. But somehow it felt less lonely than it had that morning. She had help now. And more than that, she had hope that this impossible dream of her father's might actually be possible after all. Sleep came easily that night, her body exhausted from the day's struggles. She dreamed of fields of golden wheat rippling in the breeze, stretching all the way to the horizon. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn and set about making breakfast. She made coffee strong and black, fried eggs and more biscuits, and even opened a precious jar of preserves her father had bought from a widow in town last year. When Xavier knocked on the door, the sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink. They ate quickly, both eager to get to work in the relatively cool morning hours. After breakfast, Xavier went to catch the mule while Clara cleaned up. She watched from the window as he approached the animal with a rope and a bucket of grain. The mule, who had evaded Clara's every attempt at capture, walked right up to Xavier and let herself be haltered without fuss. Clara shook her head in amazement and annoyance. With 2 animals, the work went faster. Xavier plowed while Clara followed behind, breaking up the larger clods of earth with a hoe and pulling out the worst of the rocks. It was backbreaking work, but it was work she could do, and she felt useful again rather than helpless. They fell into a rhythm, moving across the field in steady increments, and by midday they had finished another 2 acres. Over the following days they settled into a pattern. They worked from dawn until the heat became unbearable, usually around midday, then rested during the hottest hours before returning to work in the late afternoon. Clara cooked and maintained the house, and Xavier handled the heavy plowing and repairs to the property that her father had left unfinished. In the evenings after supper, they would sit on the small porch and talk while the desert cooled around them. Clara learned that Xavier had been many things in his 30 years. A ranch hand, a drover on a cattle drive to Kansas, a miner briefly in Colorado, a cavalry scout for a few months. He was educated beyond what she would have expected, having attended school through the 8th grade before his father needed him full-time on the ranch. He read when he could and had a small collection of books in his saddlebag, including a worn copy of Ivanhoe and a volume of Robert Burns' poetry. My mother taught me to love reading, he explained one evening. the book open in his lap. She said it was the way to see the world without leaving home. My father felt the same way, Clara said, though he also believed in seeing the world in person. That is how we ended up here. Do you regret it? Xavier asked. Ending up here, I mean. Clara considered the question. A month ago, she might have said yes, but now sitting in the cool evening air, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, with the fields taking shape around them and a harvest becoming a real possibility rather than a desperate dream, she found her answer was different. No, she said, I do not regret it. This land is hard and the work is brutal, but it is mine. I am building something here. That matters. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. It does matter, he agreed quietly. By the end of the second week, they had 10 acres plowed and ready for planting. Xavier had also repaired the lean-to's roof, fixed a broken shutter on the house, and dug an irrigation channel from the seasonal creek to the nearest field. Clara had never seen anyone work so hard or so skillfully, and she found herself watching him more than she probably should, noticing the way his hands moved with such confidence, the way he spoke gently to the animals, the way he smiled when something went right. She told herself it was only gratitude. He was helping her save her home, her future. It was natural to feel appreciative, but when he smiled at her across the supper table, or when their hands brushed accidentally while working side by side, she felt something that went beyond gratitude, something warm and fluttering that she had never experienced before. The third week brought complications. Clara needed supplies from town, seed for planting, some basic provisions, and a few tools that Xavier said would make the work easier. She did not want to go to quartzite, knowing she would face questions and skeptical looks, but there was no avoiding it. Xavier offered to go instead, but Clara shook her head. I need to face them eventually, she said, and I need to establish credit at the supply store if I'm going to buy seed. They will not extend credit to you on my behalf. Then I will go with you, Xavier said. You can handle the business, but there is no reason you need to drive the wagon alone. Clara wanted to refuse to prove she could do this by herself, but the truth was she would be grateful for the company. So she agreed, and they set off early the next morning, the old wagon creaking behind the mule and Xavier's roan tied to the back. Quartzsite was not a large town, just a collection of buildings clustered around the main road that ran west toward California. There was a general store, a supply store, a saloon, a small church, and a scattering of houses. The bank stood at the center of town, a testament to where the real power lay. As Clara drove the wagon down the main street, she could feel eyes watching from windows and doorways. She stopped in front of the supply store and climbed down, Xavier following. Inside the store was dim and cluttered, smelling of leather and tobacco and various other goods. The owner, a heavy-set man named Garrett Morrison, looked up from his account book, and his expression shifted when he saw Clara. Miss Ramsey, he said, his tone neutral. I heard you were still out at your father's place. I am, Clara said firmly, and I am here to buy seed and supplies. I will need credit until harvest. Morrison's eyes flicked to Xavier, who stood quietly behind Clara, his presence somehow reassuring. That is a lot to ask, Miss Ramsey. Your father had some credit here, but that died with him. I do not know if I can extend more without collateral. The land is my collateral, Clara said. 40 acres, with the deed free and clear. Land that has not produced a crop yet, Morrison pointed out. Land that folks say cannot be farmed proper. Then folks are wrong, Clara said, keeping her voice steady, though anger heated her cheeks. We have 10 acres plowed and ready to plant. We will have a harvest come autumn, and I will pay my debts then. We? Morrison looked at Xavier again, his eyes narrowing. Who might you be? Xavier Lockhart, Xavier said easily. I am helping Miss Ramsey with her planting. Something ugly crossed Morrison's face. I see. And you're staying out there? Clara felt her stomach tighten at the implication in his tone. Mr. Lockhart is sleeping in the lean-to and working for a share of the harvest, she said coldly. Not that my arrangements are any of your concern, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether you will extend credit or not. Morrison drummed his fingers on the counter, clearly calculating. Finally, he nodded. I will give you credit for seed and basic supplies, but if you do not pay by November, the debt transfers to the bank, and they will have claim on your land. Those are the terms. It was extortion, plain and simple, but Clara had no choice. Agreed, she said. I will need 50 pounds of wheat seed, 20 pounds of bean seed, and 10 pounds of squash seed, plus flour, sugar, coffee, and salt, and 2 new hoes and a rake. She listed off her needs while Morrison tallied the costs, his pencil scratching across the paper. The total made her wince, but it was manageable if the harvest was even halfway decent. She signed the credit agreement with a firm hand, refusing to let Morrison see any hesitation. They loaded the supplies into the wagon in silence, Clara fuming at Morrison's insinuations. As they climbed back onto the wagon seat, Xavier spoke quietly. You do not owe anyone explanations. I know, Clara said, but they will talk anyway. There will be gossip. Let them talk, Xavier said. Words do not matter. What matters is getting your crop planted and proving them all wrong. Clara looked at him, at the calm certainty in his face, and felt some of her anger ease. You are right, she said. Let them talk. They started back toward the farm, and Clara tried to put Morrison and his implications out of her mind. But as they drove, she found herself thinking about the situation from the town's perspective. An unmarried woman living alone with a man who was not family. In the Wild West, people were generally too busy surviving to worry over much about propriety. But there were still boundaries, still expectations. And Clara had no desire to become the subject of scandalous gossip, not because she cared what small-minded people thought, but because it might affect her ability to conduct business in town. Xavier, she said slowly, the way Morrison looked at us, the way he implied things, that could become a problem. Xavier was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. It could, he admitted. Though it seems unfair, you need help with the farm, and I need work and a place to stay. There is nothing improper about the arrangement. There is not, Clara agreed, but perception matters, especially for a woman alone. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels crunching over the rocky road. Finally, Xavier spoke again. There is a solution, if you were willing to consider it, though you might think it too forward of me to suggest. Clara looked at him curiously. What solution? He met her eyes briefly before looking back at the road. We could marry. It would be a business arrangement, at least at first. It would stop the gossip and give you an extra pair of hands for the farm year-round, not just until harvest. You would not have to worry about credit or people questioning your situation, and I would have a stake in the land, a real home again. Clara stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. You are suggesting we marry for practical reasons. I am suggesting we marry because it makes sense, Xavier said carefully, but I will not pretend it is only practical. Clara, I have been drifting for 5 years, and this is the first place that has felt like home in all that time. Working beside you, seeing the farm take shape, planning for the future, that has meant something to me. You are strong and smart and determined, and I admire that. If you could see your way to considering me as a husband, I would count myself fortunate. But if the idea is offensive to you, then forget I mentioned it. I will stay on as a hired hand, and to hell with the gossips. Clara's mind raced. Marriage. She had thought about marriage abstractly, the way any young woman did, but she had never had time for courting or romance. There had been the occasional young man who had expressed interest back before her father died, but nothing serious. And now here was Xavier, practical and hard-working and kind, suggesting they marry for the good of the farm. Except it was not just for the farm, was it? She had noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, the same way she found herself looking at him. There was attraction between them, even if neither had spoken it aloud. And more than that, there was respect and compatibility. They worked well together. They enjoyed each other's company. Was that not a better foundation for marriage than some of the love matches she had seen that burned hot and then fizzled out? "I do not find the idea offensive," she said slowly. "But Xavier, I need to be honest with you. I have no experience with men. I am not sure I would know how to be a proper wife." "Then we will figure it out together," Xavier said. "I have no experience being a husband. We would be learning as we go either way." He paused, then added, "I know this is sudden. You do not have to decide right now. Think about it. But Clara, whatever you decide, I am not leaving before harvest. You have my word on that." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotions she could not quite name. "Thank you," she managed, "for offering, and for understanding that I need time to think." They spoke little the rest of the way home, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Clara's mind turned over Xavier's proposal from every angle. Marriage. To a man she had known for less than a month. It was madness. It was impractical. It was also, she had to admit, tempting. Not just for the practical advantages, but because the thought of Xavier leaving after the harvest filled her with a hollow sadness she had not expected. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to having someone to talk to and work beside. More than accustomed. She looked forward to their evenings on the porch, to their conversations over meals, to the way he smiled at her when she said something that amused him. Was that love? She did not know. But it might be the beginning of love, given time and nurturing. And was that not enough? That evening after supper, Clara made her decision. Xavier was sitting on the porch, reading by the light of a lantern, when she came out and sat beside him. "I have thought about your proposal," she said without preamble. Xavier closed his book and gave her his full attention. And yes, Clara said, "I will marry you if the offer still stands." Something lit in Xavier's eyes, a warmth that made Clara's heart skip. "The offer stands," he said. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel pressured." "I am sure," Clara said. "You are right that it makes practical sense, but it is more than that. I like you, Xavier. I like working with you and talking to you. I think we could build something good together, not just the farm, but a real partnership. Maybe even love, in time." "Clara," Xavier said, and his voice had gone rough, "I need to tell you something. I said this would be a business arrangement, at least at first, but that was not entirely honest. I have feelings for you. Real feelings. I did not want to pressure you by admitting it, but if we are going to marry, you should know. This is not just practical for me." Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest. "It is not just practical for me either," she admitted. "I think about you more than I probably should. I notice things about you, the way you move, the way you smile. I thought it was just gratitude, but it is more than that." Xavier reached out and took her hand, his large calloused palm warm around her smaller fingers. "Then we have a real chance at happiness," he said. "Not just a business arrangement, but a true marriage." "Yes," Clara whispered. And then Xavier was leaning toward her slowly enough that she could have pulled away if she wanted to, but she did not want to. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle and careful, asking rather than demanding, and Clara felt something settle into place inside her, as if a piece she had not known was missing had finally been found. When they parted, both were smiling. "When?" Xavier asked. "When do you want to marry?" "Soon," Clara said, "before planting, so we can plant as husband and wife. There is a minister in town. We can go back tomorrow and arrange it." And so they did. The next morning they drove back to Quartzsite and found Reverend Thomas Patterson, the circuit preacher who served the small church. He was a middle-aged man with a kind face and a practical attitude toward the realities of frontier life. When Clara and Xavier explained they wanted to marry, he agreed without hesitation or judgment. "Tomorrow morning," he suggested. "I can do the ceremony after Sunday service. You will need 2 witnesses. Do you have anyone?" Clara thought of Garrett Morrison and his implications and decided against asking anyone from town. But Xavier had an idea. "There is a couple who homesteads about 5 miles from Clara's place, the Johnsons. I met them when I was catching the mule. They seemed friendly enough." And so it was arranged. The Johnsons, A weathered couple in their 50s who had been farming in the territory for a decade agreed readily to stand as witnesses. The next morning, Clara wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that her father had bought her 2 years ago, and Xavier wore clean clothes with his hair combed back. They stood before Reverend Patterson in the small church, with the Johnsons as witnesses and a handful of curious townspeople looking on, and spoke their vows. I, Xavier Lockhart, take you, Clara Ramsey, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, provide for you, and stand beside you in whatever comes. I, Clara Ramsey, take you, Xavier Lockhart, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to honor you, partner with you, and stand beside you in whatever comes. The words were simple, but they carried weight. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, and Xavier kissed her in front of the gathered witnesses, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She had a partner now, someone who would share the burdens and the joys, someone who saw her as an equal rather than a burden or a problem to be managed. They signed the marriage certificate, and Clara Ramsey became Clara Lockhart. The name felt strange on her tongue, but also right somehow, as if she had been waiting for it without knowing. The Johnsons insisted on treating them to lunch at the small restaurant in town, a generous gesture that Clara appreciated more than she could express. Over roast chicken and potatoes, they talked about farming and crops and the challenges of making a life in the harsh Arizona territory. The Johnsons offered advice freely, and Clara and Xavier listened carefully, knowing that experience like theirs was valuable beyond measure. You two will do just fine, War, Mrs. Johnson said as they finished the meal. You have the look of people who will not quit no matter how hard it gets. That is what it takes out here. They drove home as husband and wife, and Clara felt giddy and nervous all at once. They had married for practical reasons, yes, but they had also married with real feelings between them, feelings that had grown from attraction and respect into something deeper. Tonight, Xavier would not sleep in the lean-to. Tonight he would share her bed, and Clara had only the vaguest idea of what that meant beyond the basic facts. As if reading her thoughts, Xavier reached over and took her hand. We do not have to rush anything, he said quietly. We have all the time in the world. Clara squeezed his hand gratefully. I am nervous, she admitted, but I want this. I want you. I want you too, Xavier said, and I promise to be gentle. We will figure it out together. That night, after a quiet supper, they went into the bedroom together. Xavier was patient and careful, and Clara discovered that the marriage bed was not something to fear, but something to enjoy, a coming together that was both physical and emotional. Afterward, lying in Xavier's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Clara felt a peace she had not known since before her father died. She was not alone anymore. She had a partner, a husband, a future that stretched out with possibility rather than dread. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? Xavier asked, his hand moving gently through her unbound hair. For stopping when you saw me struggling with that plow. For offering to help. For staying. For everything. Xavier pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Thank you for letting me stay, for giving me a chance at a home again. I promise I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that. You already are, Clara said, and she meant it with her whole heart. The next weeks were a blur of activity. With the fields plowed and their partnership officially recognized, they threw themselves into planting. Xavier showed Clara how to space the seeds properly, how to cover them and pack the soil. They planted wheat in long rows, beans in smaller patches, and squash near the irrigation channel where the water would reach them easily. It was exhausting work, but it was also hopeful work, each seed a promise of future harvest. As they worked, they talked and laughed and grew closer. Clara learned about Xavier's childhood in Texas, about his mother who had loved music, and his father who had taught him to respect the land. Xavier learned about Clara's mother, who had been frail but determined, about her brother who had always resented the frontier life, about her father who had dreamed so big and worked so hard to make those dreams real. He would have liked you, Clara said one evening as they rested after a long day of planting. "My father. He would have appreciated your work ethic and your honesty." "I wish I could have met him," Xavier said. "He raised a remarkable daughter. That speaks well of him." At night they lay together in the narrow bed, and Clara discovered the pleasure of physical intimacy with someone she cared for deeply. Xavier was always gentle and attentive, and the marriage bed became a place of joy and closeness rather than duty. Clara found herself falling more in love with her husband each day, marveling at how quickly he had become essential to her happiness. By mid-April, all 10 acres were planted, and they turned their attention to the other necessary work of the farm. Xavier built a proper chicken coop, and Clara bought 6 hens from the Johnsons, who had more than they needed. Fresh eggs improved their diet immensely, and Clara even had enough to trade in town for other supplies. Xavier repaired the barn's foundation and reinforced the lean-to, then started work on expanding the house, adding a second room that could serve as a parlor or eventually a nursery. The thought of children made Clara blush and smile all at once. She was not pregnant yet, as far as she knew, but the possibility hovered in the future like another promise: a family. Children to carry on the legacy of this land her father had loved. It seemed like a dream, but it was a dream that was becoming more real every day. In May, the first green shoots appeared in the fields, pushing up through the dark soil. Clara and Xavier walked the rows together, examining each tender plant with the anxious care of new parents. The wheat was coming up strong. The beans looked healthy, and even the squash showed promising growth. It would be months before they knew for certain if the harvest would be successful, but the signs were good. "It is going to work," Clara said, gripping Xavier's hand tightly. "It is really going to work." "It is," Xavier agreed, pulling her close and kissing her thoroughly right there in the middle of the field. "Your father was right about this land. It just needed someone stubborn enough to make it produce." "Someone like you," Clara teased. "Someone like us," Xavier corrected, and Clara felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. The summer was hot and dry, as summers in Arizona always were. They hauled water from the creek and the well, irrigating carefully to make every drop count. Xavier built a better irrigation system, digging channels and installing crude gates that allowed them to direct water where it was most needed. Clara tended the vegetable garden she had planted near the house, coaxing tomatoes and peppers and herbs from the stubborn soil. They worked from dawn until the heat became unbearable, then rested during the worst of the afternoon before returning to work in the evening. It was hard, relentless labor, but they faced it together. On the worst days, when the heat made every breath feel like inhaling from an oven, when the crops looked stressed despite their best efforts, when Clara felt despair creeping in, Xavier would take her in his arms and remind her of how far they had come. And on the good days, when the monsoon rains finally came in July and the crops drank deep and grew lush, when they could see the wheat beginning to head out, when everything seemed possible, they celebrated together with laughter and love. In August, Clara realized she had missed her monthly courses twice. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes until she was certain, but by mid-month there was no denying it. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. A baby. She and Xavier were going to have a baby. She told him that evening after supper, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. Xavier's face went blank with shock for a moment, then lit up with such pure happiness that Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks. "A baby," he said wonderingly. He pulled her close, his hand settling gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "I am beyond happy," Xavier said. "Clara, you have given me everything. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I do not have words for how grateful I am." They held each other as the sun set outside, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Clara thought about the future. A harvest to bring in, a baby to prepare for, a life to build together. It was overwhelming and wonderful all at once. The wheat ripened in late September, turning the field into a sea of gold that rippled in the breeze. Xavier borrowed a scythe from the Johnsons and began the work of harvesting, cutting the stalks and bundling them into sheaves. Clara helped as much as her growing pregnancy would allow, binding the sheaves and shocking them in the field to dry. The work was backbreaking and endless, but the sight of all that grain filled Clara with fierce pride. They had done this. Against all the doubts and obstacles, they had grown a crop on land everyone said was worthless. The Johnsons came to help with the threshing, and together they worked for 2 solid weeks separating the grain from the chaff. When it was done, they had 40 bushels of wheat, more than enough to pay their debts and have seed for next year's planting, with extra to sell for cash. The beans and squash had done well too, providing food for their table and surplus to trade or sell. In early October, Clara and Xavier loaded the wagon with grain and drove to Quartzsite. They paid off their debt to Garrett Morrison in full, and Clara took great satisfaction in the man's surprised expression. They sold the surplus wheat to a buyer who was passing through on his way to California, and suddenly they had actual money, more cash than Clara had seen in years. "We did it," she said to Xavier as they drove home, the wagon empty but their pockets full. "We actually did it?" "You did it," Xavier said. "This was your dream, Clara. I just helped make it happen." "Our dream," Clara corrected. "We are partners, remember, in everything." Xavier smiled and pulled her close, kissing her temple. "In everything," he agreed. November brought cooler weather, and Clara's pregnancy became obvious to anyone who looked. She moved more slowly now, her belly round and prominent, but she was healthy, and the baby was active. Xavier fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting she rest more and take on only light chores. Clara found it both endearing and exasperating, but she knew it came from love, so she submitted with good grace. They used some of their harvest money to buy supplies for the baby. Soft flannel for diapers and gowns, a small cradle that Xavier spent weeks carefully crafting, and a precious store-bought blanket that Clara wrapped around herself sometimes, imagining the baby swaddled in its softness. The second room Xavier had built became the nursery, painted white and filled with love and anticipation. In December, as the desert nights turned cold, Clara felt the first pains of labor. Xavier rode like the devil to fetch Mrs. Johnson, who had delivered more babies than she could count, and Clara was grateful for the older woman's calm presence as the contractions grew stronger. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day, but Mrs. Johnson was encouraging throughout, and Xavier stayed by Clara's side, holding her hand and wiping her face with cool cloths. Finally, as the winter sun climbed high in the sky, Clara gave one last desperate push and felt the baby slide free. A moment later, a furious wail filled the room, and Mrs. Johnson laughed with delight. "A boy," she announced, holding up the squalling, red-faced infant. A big, healthy boy. Clara burst into tears as Mrs. Johnson cleaned the baby and laid him on her chest. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and surprisingly large hands that waved furiously in the air. Xavier knelt beside the bed, his own eyes wet, and touched the baby's head with one gentle finger. "Hello, son," he whispered. "Welcome to the world." They named him Thomas, after Clara's father, with the middle name of Xavier for his father. Thomas Xavier Lockhart, born on December 15, 1882, on 40 acres of Arizona Territory land that had been deemed worthless by everyone except his mother. Clara thought her father would have been proud. The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Thomas was a hungry baby with strong lungs, and Clara spent most of her time nursing or soothing him. Xavier took over all the household chores without complaint, cooking and cleaning and tending the animals so Clara could rest when the baby slept. At night, when Thomas woke crying, Xavier would bring him to Clara and then stay awake with them, talking softly or singing old songs his mother had taught him. "You are a good father," Clara told him one night as they watched Thomas nurse, His tiny hand curled around her finger. I am trying, Xavier said. He's so small. I am terrified I will break him. You will not, Clara assured him. You are gentle with him. He knows you love him. That is what matters. As spring approached, they began preparing for the second planting season. Xavier did most of the heavy work while Clara managed what she could with the baby tied to her back in a sling. Thomas seemed to enjoy the outdoor time, watching the world with solemn dark eyes that were already clearly going to be brown like his father's. The second year's crop was even better than the first, benefiting from the improvements Xavier had made to the irrigation system and their growing experience. They expanded to 15 acres and added a few head of cattle, purchased with their second year's profits. The farm was becoming a real operation, and their reputation in Quartzsite shifted from skeptical to respectful. Garrett Morrison even apologized in his gruff way for his earlier doubts and implications. You have proved me wrong, Mrs. Lockhart, he said when Clara came to town for supplies. Your farm is the talk of the territory. Everyone wants to know how you made that land produce. Hard work and stubbornness, Clara said simply, and a good partner. As the years passed, the farm continued to prosper. They added more cattle, built a proper barn, and improved the house with a second bedroom and an expanded kitchen. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father everywhere, and in 1885 Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine Rose. 2 years later, another son arrived, named Michael after Xavier's father. The house rang with children's laughter and the sounds of a busy, happy family. By 1889, the Lockhart farm was one of the most successful small operations in the Quartzsite area. They had 30 acres under cultivation, a small but quality herd of cattle, and a reputation for hard work and fair dealing. Clara and Xavier had become pillars of the small community, the kind of people others turned to for advice or help. On their 7th anniversary, Xavier took Clara to the same field where they had first met, where she had been struggling alone with a plow and he had stopped to help. The field was lush with growing wheat now, green and healthy, and Clara could hardly believe this was the same rocky, impossible soil she had fought so hard against. Do you ever regret it? Xavier asked, pulling her close. Agreeing to marry me so quickly? Taking a chance on a drifter? Clara looked up at her husband, at the face that had become more dear to her than her own, at the man who had given her everything she had ever wanted and things she had never known to dream of. Not for a single moment, she said. You gave me a partner when I needed one, a husband when I was ready for one, and a love I never expected. How could I regret that? I am the one who should be grateful, Xavier said. You gave a homeless drifter a reason to stay in one place. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You saved me, Clara, every bit as much as I helped you save this farm. They kissed in the middle of the field, surrounded by the wheat that represented everything they had built together. 3 children played in the yard near the house, watched over by Mrs. Johnson, who had become like a grandmother to them. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold, and Clara thought about how far they had come from that desperate morning when she had been dragging a plow alone through rocky soil. Xavier had stopped and helped. He had finished the plowing and stayed for the planting and the harvest and every day since. He had given her his strength when hers faltered, his hope when hers failed, his love without reservation or condition. And in return she had given him the same, building a life together that was richer than either could have imagined. I love you, Clara said, the words simple but encompassing everything she felt. I love you too, Xavier replied. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after, always. And there in the field that had brought them together, surrounded by the life they had built from stubborn soil and stubborn hearts, Clara and Xavier held each other and looked toward the future. There would be more harvests, more challenges, more joys and sorrows like any life held. But they would face it all together, partners in every sense of the word, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing season. The children's laughter carried on the breeze, a promise of the future taking root in the present. Thomas would eventually take over the farm, with his siblings helping to build the Lockhart holdings into something even greater. But that was years away. For now, there was just this moment, this perfect afternoon, this love that had started with a simple act of kindness and grown into something enduring. Clara leaned into Xavier's embrace and smiled. The land her father had loved had indeed proven fruitful, but not just in crops. It had given her Xavier, had given them each other, and together they had created something beautiful and lasting. The rocky soil had been conquered not by force, but by persistence, by partnership, by love that grew stronger in adversity. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Clara and Xavier walked hand in hand back toward their home, toward their children, toward the future they were building together one day at a time. The plow that Clara had once dragged alone sat in the barn now, a relic of harder times, but also a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had accomplished when they joined their strengths together. Some nights, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Clara and Xavier would sit on the porch and look out over their land, remembering that first day and marveling at the journey since. "I almost did not stop," Xavier confessed once. "I saw you struggling, and my first instinct was to ride on, to not get involved. I had been alone so long I'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something." "But you did stop," Clara said. "That is what matters. You chose to help, and that choice changed both our lives." "For the better," Xavier said firmly. "Always for the better." In 1890, when Clara turned 30, Xavier threw her a party that brought together all their neighbors and friends. The Johnsons were there, as were other farming families who had watched the Lockharts succeed against the odds and had been inspired by their example. Garrett Morrison even attended, bringing a nice set of china as a gift and admitting he had been wrong about Clara from the start. The house overflowed with laughter and food and friendship, and Clara stood in the middle of it all and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, this family, this farm, it had all seemed impossible 7 years ago when she was alone and desperate and fighting a losing battle with the land. But Xavier had stopped and helped, and from that simple act had grown this abundance, this richness of life and love that filled every corner of her world. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, Clara and Xavier lay together in their room, tired but happy. "Thank you for the party," Clara said, "and for everything else, for all of it." "Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me," Xavier replied, "for taking a chance on us. I know it was not easy, trusting a stranger with your future." "You were not a stranger," Clara said, "not really. From the moment you stopped to help, I knew you were different. I knew I could trust you, and I was right." Xavier pulled her close, and they lay in comfortable silence, listening to the soft sounds of their children sleeping in the next room and the gentle night noises from outside. This was home, Clara thought. This was family. This was love in its fullest, most complete form. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the usual joys and challenges of farm life. There were years when the crops failed due to drought or pests, and years when they thrived beyond expectation. There were illnesses and injuries, losses and triumphs. Through it all, Clara and Xavier faced everything together, their partnership growing only stronger with time. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the land as much as his grandfather had. Catherine became a bright, spirited girl who kept her brothers in line and helped her mother with the endless work of running a household. Michael was the quietest of the three, but also the most thoughtful, with a gift for understanding animals that served the farm well. In 1895, Clara and Xavier expanded their holdings by purchasing an adjacent 40 acres from an elderly farmer who was retiring. The Lockhart farm now stretched across 80 acres, and they hired help during planting and harvest seasons, providing work for men who might otherwise have drifted aimlessly like Xavier once had. Clara always made sure the hired hands were fed well and treated fairly, remembering how Xavier had arrived with nothing and been willing to work for just food and shelter. "You are giving them what I gave you," Xavier observed one evening as they watched a new hire, a young man from back east who was learning farming the hard way. "A chance to be part of something." "I am giving them what you gave me," Clara corrected. "Hope. That makes all the difference." On their 10th anniversary in 1892, Xavier had surprised Clara with a gift he had been saving for, a beautiful piano shipped all the way from California. Clara had mentioned once that her mother had played piano, and Xavier had remembered. The piano became the centerpiece of their expanded parlor, and Clara taught herself to play again from the old sheet music her mother had left her. Soon, the house filled with music in the evenings, with the children learning to play and sing, with Xavier's deep voice joining in on the old songs. It was during these evening music sessions that Clara felt most content, most certain that she had built exactly the life she was meant to live. Her father would have loved this, she thought. He would have loved seeing the land flourish, seeing his grandchildren grow strong and happy, seeing his daughter thriving instead of merely surviving. The farm continued to prosper into the new century. By 1900, the Lockharts were considering buying more land and expanding into horse breeding, which Xavier had always been good at. Thomas was 18 now, a man grown, and talking about courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Catherine was 15 and already a beauty, though she showed more interest in learning bookkeeping and business than in attracting suitors. Michael was 13 and happiest when working with the cattle. Clara, now 40 years old, sometimes looked in the mirror and marveled at how her life had turned out. The worried, desperate young woman who had been dragging a plow alone seemed like someone from another lifetime. She had gray in her dark hair now, and lines around her eyes from squinting in the sun. But she was healthy and strong and happy beyond measure. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He was 45 now, with silver threading through his dark hair and deeper lines in his weathered face, but he was still strong and vital, still the man who had stopped to help all those years ago. "How lucky I am," Clara said, leaning back against him. "How lucky we are." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Xavier said, kissing her temple. "You worked for everything we have. You fought for it when anyone else would have given up." "We fought for it," Clara insisted, "together. That is why we succeeded." Xavier turned her to face him, his dark eyes serious and warm. "I love you, Clara Lockhart. More today than yesterday, more tomorrow than today. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "And you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Clara replied. "The day you stopped and helped me with that plow was the day my real life began." They kissed in the bedroom of the house they had built together, surrounded by the life they had created from nothing but hard work and stubborn hope. Outside, the fields stretched green and gold. The cattle lowed in the barn, and the sound of their children's voices drifted in from the parlor. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, and Clara knew she would not trade it for anything in the world. As the years continued, the Lockhart family remained at the heart of the Quartzsite community. Xavier served on the town council, helping to bring improvements like a better school and a proper doctor's office. Clara became known for her generosity, always the first to organize help when a neighbor faced hardship. Their children grew and thrived, each finding their own path while remaining connected to the land that had given their family its foundation. Thomas married the rancher's daughter in 1902, a lovely girl named Sarah who fit into the Lockhart family as if she had always belonged. They built a house on the far edge of the property and began working toward eventually taking over the farm operations. In 1903, they made Clara and Xavier grandparents for the first time, a boy they named Thomas Xavier Lockhart Jr. Clara held her grandson and cried happy tears, marveling at the continuation of the family line that had almost ended before it began. Catherine surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to attend normal school and become a teacher. Clara and Xavier, despite their initial concerns about their daughter leaving home, supported her dream. Catherine went to Phoenix for her education and returned 2 years later as a certified teacher, taking a position at the Quartzsite schoolhouse and becoming beloved by her students. She eventually married a merchant from town, a kind man who appreciated her intelligence and independence. Michael proved to have his father's gift with animals and his mother's head for business. He focused on developing the Lockhart cattle operation, improving the bloodlines, and building relationships with buyers across the territory. By 1910, the Lockhart cattle were known for their quality throughout Arizona and beyond. Clara and Xavier, now in their 50s, gradually handed over more of the daily operations to their children, while remaining active advisors and constant presences. They took joy in watching their grandchildren grow, in seeing the farm continue to expand and prosper, in knowing that what they had built together would last beyond their own lifetimes. On quiet evenings, they still walked out to that first field, sometimes the one where they had met. The soil that had once been so rocky and impossible was rich and dark now, decades of careful cultivation having transformed it completely. It was a metaphor for their own lives, Clara thought. What had seemed impossible had become not only possible but abundant, transformed by persistent work and abiding love. "Do you remember what I said the day I proposed?" Xavier asked one evening as they stood in the field, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You said it would be a business arrangement," Clara said with a smile, "at least at first." Xavier laughed. "That lasted all of about 5 minutes. I was already in love with you by then. I just did not want to scare you off." "I was already falling in love with you too," Clara admitted. "I just did not know what to call it yet. I had never been in love before." "Neither had I," Xavier said. "We figured it out together, though, like we figured out everything else." "Together," Clara agreed, taking his hand. "Always together." In 1912, Clara and Xavier celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a host of friends and neighbors. The celebration was held at the farm, with tables set up under the stars and lanterns hanging from the trees. There was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. As Clara and Xavier danced together under the starlit sky, Clara reflected on the incredible journey they had taken together. 30 years. 3 children, 7 grandchildren so far, and countless memories. A farm that had grown from 40 struggling acres to a prosperous 200-acre operation. A love that had started as attraction and respect and deepened into something so profound that Clara could not imagine existence without Xavier by her side. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked as they swayed to the music. "That I am the luckiest woman alive," Clara said. "That the best decision I ever made was saying yes when you offered to help." "The best decision I ever made was stopping," Xavier said. "I almost rode right past. My whole life would have been different." "Both our lives," Clara said. "Thank you for stopping, for helping, for staying." "Thank you for letting me," Xavier replied. "For seeing past the drifter to the man who wanted a home, for building this life with me." They held each other close as the music played on, and Clara sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought Xavier to her that desperate morning so long ago. She thought of her father, who had died believing in this land, and wished he could see what it had become. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to be strong, and knew her mother would be proud. Most of all, she thought of the journey she and Xavier had taken together, from strangers to partners to lovers to the center of each other's world. The years continued their steady march. More grandchildren were born. The farm continued to prosper. Clara and Xavier grew older gracefully, their hair turning silver, their faces lined with age, but their eyes still bright when they looked at each other. They had been blessed with good health, both remaining active and engaged well into their 60s. In 1920, they celebrated their 38th anniversary quietly, just the two of them. The children had offered to throw a party, but Clara and Xavier had declined, preferring to spend the day together on the farm they loved. They walked the property, visiting all their favorite spots, remembering the field where they met, the creek where Xavier had taught Thomas to fish, the garden where Clara had grown vegetables to feed their growing family, the barn where all 3 children had learned to milk cows and muck stalls. "We have had a good life," Clara said as they sat on the porch in the evening watching the sunset. "The best life," Xavier agreed. "No regrets, Clara, not a single one." "Not one," Clara confirmed. "Every challenge was worth it. Every struggle led to something better. I would not change a thing." Xavier took her hand, his grip still strong despite his years. "Neither would I." "You have been the great love of my life, Clara Lockhart. Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me." "And you were mine," Clara said, tears pricking her eyes. "You still are. You always will be." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, as they had done thousands of times before. The farm was quiet around them. The animals settled for the night. The fields resting between seasons. Inside the house, evidence of their life together filled every room. Photographs of children and grandchildren, furniture Xavier had built, quilts Clara had sewn, books they had read together, dishes they had eaten from for decades. It was a life full and rich and complete, a legacy that would continue through their children and grandchildren and generations yet to come. It had started with a simple act of kindness, a drifter stopping to help a desperate woman with an impossible task. From that moment had grown this entire world, this family, this love that had sustained them through nearly 4 decades of joy and hardship, triumph and loss, ordinary days and extraordinary moments. As Clara and Xavier sat together in the gathering darkness, their hands intertwined, they knew they had achieved something rare and precious. They had built not just a successful farm, but a true partnership, a love that had only deepened with time. They had proven that the most impossible-seeming soil could yield the richest harvest if tended with care and patience and abiding faith. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and eternal, witnessing their quiet moment of gratitude and reflection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every tomorrow did. But for tonight, there was just this: 2 people who had found each other against the odds, who had built something lasting and beautiful together, who loved each other more with each passing year. Clara leaned her head on Xavier's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat that way until the moon rose high and the night grew deep around them. 2 hearts beating in perfect unison, 2 lives woven together so completely that neither could imagine where one ended and the other began. In the field where they had first met, the wheat grew tall and strong, rustling softly in the night breeze. The rocky soil that had once seemed so impossible had long since yielded its bounty, transformed by decades of loving care into something fertile and giving. Just like their love had transformed them, taking 2 lonely, struggling individuals and making them something greater together than they ever could have been apart. And as the night deepened and the stars shone bright above the Arizona desert, Clara and Xavier held each other and knew they had found what everyone searches for but few ever truly find: a love that lasts a lifetime, a partnership that makes everything possible, a home built not just of adobe and wood but of shared dreams and mutual respect and abiding devotion. Their story had started with a woman alone, dragging a plow through impossible soil, and a cowboy who stopped to help. But it had become so much more, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of partnership, and the transformative nature of love that grows deeper and richer with each passing season. It was a story of the Wild West at its best, of people carving lives from harsh land through grit and determination and refusing to give up on their dreams. And on this night, their 38th anniversary, Clara and Xavier Lockhart sat together under the stars and knew without question that every struggle had been worth it. Every challenge had made them stronger, and every day together had been a gift beyond measure. Their love story, which had begun with a simple act of compassion on a dusty Arizona morning, would echo through generations to come, a reminder that the greatest harvests come not from the easiest soil, but from the ground we work together with patience, faith, and love.